Well, the party is over, Keir Starmer.
No one inside the House of Commons expected what happened next. Prime Minister's questions had followed the usual script: rehearsed outrage, predictable sound bites, polite heckling. Then Nigel Farage stood up, no shouting, no theatrics, just a folder in his hand. At 2:43 p.m, as the chamber settled into its usual rhythm, Nigel Farage stood up, no heckling, no grandstanding, just silence, and a thin folder held firmly in his hand. The moment felt different immediately. Even seasoned MPs sensed it. Conversations stopped. Phones were lowered. The speaker leaned forward. Farage spoke calmly, almost quietly. "Prime Minister," he said, "can you explain why your government is paying £127 per night to house illegal Channel migrants while British veterans are sleeping on our streets?" The Commons froze. For a split second, the chamber seemed to forget how to react. There were no jeers, no cheers, no laughter. Just an uncomfortable stillness as the weight of the question landed. Cameras cut straight to Keir Starmer. Before we go any further, let me ask you something. If you care about what's really happening in British politics behind the headlines, beyond the spin, then please take just 1 second to like this video and subscribe to the Britain Daily. It's completely free and it helps us keep bringing you the hard-hitting stories that matter. The Prime Minister didn't respond immediately. His expression hardened. His notes were untouched. His mouth opened, then closed again. It was a hesitation Britain noticed instantly. When he finally spoke, it wasn't with authority. He talked about complex housing challenges. He mentioned temporary accommodation pressures. He spoke of ongoing reviews. But he never denied the figure. That omission was devastating. Labour MPs shifted uneasily on the benches behind him. Some stared straight ahead, others glanced sideways at colleagues, clearly unsettled. A few shook their heads. Farage didn't interrupt. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't push. He let the silence do the damage. Across the country, millions watching live understood what they had just witnessed. This wasn't a debate. It was exposure. And then came the moment that sent shockwaves through Westminster. 2 Labour MPs stood up, then another, then another. Quietly, without protest or announcement, they walked out of the chamber. Not in anger, but in embarrassment. The Speaker called for order, but order had already collapsed. The authority of the Prime Minister, carefully constructed over years, was visibly cracking in real time. Farage sat back down. He had asked one question, and Parliament would never sound the same again. Outside Westminster, journalists scrambled, news alerts flashed, phones buzzed. Producers began replaying the exchange on loop. Inside the chamber, Keir Starmer remained standing, a Prime Minister still speaking but no longer being heard because the country had already reached its verdict. And this was only the beginning. By the time Prime Minister's questions ended, Westminster was no longer in control of the narrative. The country was. Within minutes, the clip was everywhere. Phones buzzed across offices, pubs, factories and living rooms. Social media platforms buckled under the weight of reposts. The exchange wasn't edited, reframed or softened. It didn't need to be. One question, one figure, one silence, £127 per night. That number burned itself into the national consciousness. News channels abandoned their planned schedules. Panel shows were hastily assembled. Former ministers, housing experts, veterans charities and policy analysts were pulled into studios with one urgent demand: explain how this happened. And crucially, explain why the Prime Minister couldn't. Outside Parliament, journalists surged toward Labour MPs emerging from side exits. The questions were blunt. Did the figure sound accurate? Were veterans being neglected? Was the policy sustainable? Most refused to answer. Some looked furious, others looked ashamed. A few simply walked faster. Inside Downing Street, panic set in. Senior advisors scrambled to draft a response, but there was a problem they couldn't escape. Any denial would require evidence. Any clarification would require transparency. And transparency in this moment was the last thing they wanted. The Home Office remained silent. That silence spoke louder than any press release. Veterans groups moved first. Statements were released within hours, condemning what they'd described as a moral failure at the heart of government priorities. Images of former soldiers sleeping rough began circulating again, but this time they were paired with Farage's question on screen. The contrast was brutal. By evening, protests were being organised online. Not massive crowds yet, but something more dangerous for a government already on edge. Focused anger, disciplined anger. The kind that doesn't burn out overnight. Polling agencies moved fast. An overnight Snap survey showed Labour's support slipping sharply in key working class constituencies, the very seats Starmer could not afford to lose. Reform UK, meanwhile, surged, pulling voters not just from the Conservatives, but directly from Labour. The shift wasn't ideological, it was emotional. People weren't arguing policy, they were asking a simpler question. Who comes first? As the story rolled on, another detail emerged that worsened the damage. Officials quietly confirmed that the £127 figure didn't include additional security and administrative costs. The real number was higher, much higher. Late-night comedy shows seized on it. Satirical cartoons appeared within hours. But beneath the humour was something darker, a growing sense that the political class was no longer listening at all. Nigel Farage, for his part, didn't celebrate. He gave one short statement to cameras outside Westminster. Calm, controlled, surgical. This isn't about migrants versus veterans, he said. It's about priorities. And today, Britain saw the truth. That line would be replayed for days. Inside number 10, Keir Starmer faced a reality he could no longer manage with messaging alone. The question had been asked. The silence had answered it. And now the consequences were coming. By the following morning, it was clear this was no longer just a political embarrassment. It was a legitimacy crisis. The Prime Minister's office finally issued a statement just after dawn. It was carefully worded, legally cautious and emotionally empty. It spoke of complex accommodation costs, temporary pressures and ongoing reviews. What it did not mention once were veterans. That omission was fatal. Across the country, breakfast television played split screens. Starmer's statement on one side, images of former soldiers sleeping in doorways on the other. The narrative was locked in. No clarification could undo it now. Then came the moment no one expected. At a remembrance event scheduled long before the controversy, King Charles made a brief, unscripted remark. No names, no policies, just one sentence that cut straight through Westminster's defences. We must never forget those who served us first. Royal protocol experts immediately noted the significance. The King hadn't intervened directly. But he didn't need to. The message was unmistakable and the country heard it. Within minutes, the footage went viral. The silence from Downing Street returned, this time heavier than before. Inside Labour, the fracture became visible. MPs from marginal seats began issuing their own statements, distancing themselves from government policy. Some demanded an emergency review, others called for a reset. A few, quietly, began speaking to journalists about leadership. Cabinet unity cracked. Senior figures reportedly clashed behind closed doors. The question wasn't how to fix the policy. It was whether the Prime Minister himself had become the problem. Polling confirmed the nightmare scenario. Trust ratings collapsed faster than at any point in Starmer's leadership. Voters who once saw him as safe, steady and competent now described him with a different word: detached. Meanwhile, Reform UK rallies filled town halls and high streets. Farage didn't shout. He didn't gloat. He simply repeated the same line again and again. A country that forgets its veterans forgets itself. That message landed where spreadsheets and statements never could. By the end of the week, the government was no longer dictating events. It was reacting to them. Every move looked defensive. Every delay looked guilty. Every silence looked deliberate. And hanging over it all was the original moment. 2:43 p.m, one folder, one question, one Prime Minister with no answer. Political careers rarely end in a single speech, but sometimes they begin to collapse in a single silence. Now Britain stands at a crossroads. Is this just another storm Westminster hopes will pass, or was this the moment voters finally stopped listening and started deciding? Because one thing is certain. After that question, British politics did not go back to normal, and Keir Starmer may never recover control again.